So I want you to picture the most impenetrable fortress you can possibly imagine, just the absolute center of global power.
Right, like today we'd immediately think of underground bunkers or, massive layers of elite security details.
Exactly. You expect this whole apparatus that puts an unbreakable wall between a world leader and any kind of threat. There's this aura of just complete, unquestionable invulnerability.
Yeah, and that expectation of physical security, it's really the baseline of how we understand power, right? The assumption that the person in the highest office is just fundamentally untouchable by brute force.
Right. Now, I want you to transplant that assumption into the early 14th century, specifically September 1303. We are stepping right into the middle of the outrage of Anagni.
Oh, man. Yeah, this is where it gets intense.
It really does, because suddenly that impenetrable fortress is just violently, brutally breached. I mean, mercenaries literally kick in the doors of the papal palace, the attackers are out for blood, and that whole illusion of invulnerability, it shatters in a single instant.
It was a total collapse of both the physical and political security of the papacy. We're looking at a scenario where the sovereign authority of the church was subjected to a literal home invasion by heavily armed political operatives.
And when those doors splinter open, almost the entire papal court, I'm talking the elite guards, the trusted advisors, the inner circle sworn to protect the Pope, they just flee in absolute terror.
Yeah, they're scrambling out of windows, running out the back doors.
Yeah.
Just total panic.
It's like imagining a modern geopolitical crisis where the Secret Service just completely abandons a world leader to an assassination squad. But in the middle of this chaos, two men do not run.
Right, just two.
Two cardinals stand their ground in this echoing, terrifying palace, basically facing down hostile forces to protect the elderly Pope Boniface VIII.
And that choice, to stay when survival basically screams at you to run, that's the real anchor of our analysis today.
Exactly. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are tearing into this really fascinating stack of historical archives, encyclopedias, and Dominican texts, and we're focusing on one of those two men who stayed.
A guy whose origin story is just as wild as his time in power.
Seriously. He started as an impoverished orphan, completely bypassed the traditional rules to rise to the highest seat of power in Europe, and held the papacy for just 8 incredibly turbulent months. We're exploring the life of Pope Benedict XI, born Nicholas Boccasini.
And for anyone who's navigating deeply fractured environments today, this isn't just some obscure medieval history lesson. The sources really give us a masterclass in the mechanics of crisis leadership.
Because it's all about how a leader maintains political equilibrium, right? How do you act as a peacemaker when the world is quite literally tearing itself apart all around you?
Exactly. And to understand how Nicholas Boccasini handled arguably the greatest crisis of the medieval papacy, we first have to look at his origins, because his whole trajectory completely breaks the medieval formula for getting power.
Oh, completely. So the official records trace his birth to 1240 in Treviso, Italy. And this wasn't some grand estate. It was a suburb outside the city walls called San Bartolomeo.
Right. And the socioeconomic reality of his childhood was, well, it was intensely precarious.
Yeah.
His father, Boccasio, was a municipal notary, but he died in 1246. When Nicola was only 6 years old.
Which leaves his mother, Bernarda, utterly destitute. I mean, she's literally washing clothes for the local Dominican friars just to keep her family from starving.
There is zero noble bloodline here. No sprawling family wealth to just purchase a bishopric, which, let's be honest, was standard practice for medieval elites at the time.
Yeah, instead of wealth, there's this highly unusual financial intervention. So a local Dominican friar passes away and leaves a sum of money in his will to this orphaned family, but with one massive glaring condition attached.
A very specific string attached, yeah.
Right. The family only receives Nicholas half of the money if the boy enters the Dominican Order. Okay, let's unpack this for a second. You are looking at these texts, so you know the reality of the era. Was this child essentially bribed into a monastery out of pure financial desperation? Because locking a 6-year-old into a lifelong religious vow with a financial ultimatum, I mean, that feels highly manipulative by any standard today.
It absolutely looks like coercion through our modern lens, but the mechanics of medieval poverty dictate a very different reality.
How so?
Well, in 1246, a widow and an orphan without a patron faced the very real, very literal threat of starvation. This conditional inheritance wasn't just a bribe, It was a socioeconomic lifeline.
So it was basically an insurance policy.
Exactly. It guaranteed the boy would be fed, clothed, and most importantly, educated. And the historical evidence actually suggests he didn't just endure this environment, he really embraced it.
Yeah, the records show by age 14 in 1254, he officially took the habit of a novice in Treviso.
And he thrived intellectually. His uncle, who was a priest, tutored him initially. Then he moved up through the educational ranks in Venice and the Studium of San Eustorgio in Milan.
And he actually spent 14 years as a lector, which was basically the teacher responsible for the foundational education of the Dominican brothers. But here is the detail that really jumped out of the archives for me.
The degree thing.
Yes. Despite this deep, massive commitment to scholarship, Nicholas Boccasini is one of the last popes to never hold a university degree. I mean, how does someone rise to the pinnacle of a highly intellectualized medieval church without standard academic credentials from, like, Paris or Oxford?
Because he didn't need them.
Yeah.
The Dominican Order had built this parallel, highly rigorous academic infrastructure of its own. You didn't need a secular university degree if you could survive the internal Dominican studium system.
Because it was that intense.
Oh, it was a brutal meritocracy.
Yeah.
It focused heavily on dialectic, deep theology, rigorous debate. He ascended purely on the raw strength of his intellect and his administrative capability.
Which clearly got him noticed. By 1286, the system recognizes his talent and elects him provincial prior of Lombardy. So he's managing over 50 convents. And then by 1296, he becomes the master general of the entire Dominican Order globally.
Which is what pulls him directly into the orbit of papal power.
Yeah.
Pope Boniface VIII makes him a cardinal in 1298.
And that right there sets the stage for the violent catalyst we opened with. September 1303, the outrage of Anagni. But to really grasp what went down here, we need to look at the massive geopolitical friction that was driving it.
Right, and we really need to examine the mechanics of this conflict objectively, right? We're not adopting either side's narrative here. It's just two massive powers colliding.
Exactly. So you have King Philip V of France, known as Philip the Fair and Papal Authority under Boniface VIII, and they are locked in this existential struggle over who actually holds ultimate supremacy in Europe.
Philip needed vast sums of money to fund his wars, so he started heavily taxing the French clergy.
Which didn't go over well.
Yes, not at all. Boniface retaliated with these sweeping papal bulls, asserting that the Pope held absolute authority over both spiritual and temporal realms, basically saying kings are fundamentally subordinate to the church.
It's essentially a hostile takeover where the currency isn't money, but divine legitimacy. And Philip, well, he decides to just completely shatter the rules of engagement.
He really did.
His minister, Guillaume de Nogaret, teams up with Sciarra Colonna, who is a bitter Italian rival of the Pope. And they don't just write a strongly worded letter or try to negotiate. They gather a mercenary army and physically invade the papal retreat at Anagni.
And Nogaret's goal wasn't just a simple assassination. He wanted to violently arrest the Pope, literally drag him to France, and force a council to depose him.
The psychological shock of this must have been just, it cannot be overstated. When those mercenaries breached the palace, the entire illusion of papal invulnerability dissolved instantly.
Which is why the ensuing panic caused almost the entire court to just scatter into the hills?
But, as we mentioned, Nicholas Boccasini and Pedro Rodriguez, the Bishop of Sabina, they refused to move. Imagine standing in that episcopal palace, right? You're listening to armed mercenaries, executing guards, looting the treasury, and you know they're coming for the exact room you are standing in.
By standing beside the elderly Boniface, they were actively denying Nogaret a clean political victory. And the sources confirm they were imprisoned there for 3 agonizing days.
3 days of just waiting to be killed.
Yeah, until finally the local citizens of Anagni rallied and actually drove the mercenaries out.
But the physical and psychological toll of those 3 days completely broke Boniface VIII. He was an elderly man, and the trauma of the manhandling and the siege, it was fatal. He died just a month later, in October 1303.
And with Boniface dead, the entire power structure of Europe basically evaporated overnight.
So, the conclave meets at St. Peter's in Rome, and the atmosphere in that room must have been absolutely suffocating. The cardinals are terrified of the French king's hit squads, they're surrounded by warring Roman clans, and they know a prolonged election could spark a continent-wide war.
Because typically, conclaves in this era were infamous for dragging on, sometimes for months or even years just due to factional gridlock.
Right.
But the terrifying reality of October 1303 forced their hands. They absolutely did not have time for politics. They needed a candidate who was structurally neutral, intellectually formidable, and had undeniable courage.
And the conclave lasted exactly 1 day, which is wild.
That really is.
They looked at the man who didn't run away at Anagni. Nicola Boccasini was elected unanimously on the very first ballot. He was from Treviso, meaning he wasn't entangled in all those toxic blood feuds of the Roman families like the Orsini or the Colonna.
He was the ultimate compromise candidate, yet
Mhm.
highly respected, a scholar who had proven his nerve under fire.
So Nicola takes the throne, and he chooses the name Benedict, becoming Pope Benedict XI. But wait, we should quickly mention the historical quirk here. Why 11 and not 10?
Oh, right. So he becomes Benedict XI because, at the time, Antipope Benedict X, who reigned way back in 1058, was still considered a legitimate pope in their records. It permanently threw off the numbering for all future Pope Benedicts.
That is such a weird, fascinating little clerical error that just stuck.
Anyway, his core mission, his specific charism, if you will, becomes that of the Peacemaker Pope.
Yeah, the archives describe a man with a fundamentally sweet, forgiving disposition. He clearly preferred appeasement and diplomacy over the aggressive legal warfare that his predecessor used.
Because he inherited an absolute geopolitical nightmare.
Exactly. And his immediate instinct was systemic de-escalation.
Which he proves right out of the gate by lifting the excommunication that Boniface had dropped on King Philip I of France. He forgives the king. But, and here's where it gets really interesting, we need to look closely at his strategy here. He isn't just rolling over and surrendering.
Not at all. He releases the king to stabilize the relationship and prevent a full-blown schism, right? But he draws a massive line in the sand regarding the actual physical assault on the papacy.
This is where his highly sophisticated understanding of medieval justice really comes into play. On June 7, 1304, he issues a devastating papal bull. He absolutely refuses to pardon Guillaume de Nogaret, Sciarra Colonna, and the men who actually laid hands on the Pope at Anagni.
He excommunicates them. And for you listening, we really have to emphasize that excommunication in the 14th century isn't just some spiritual penalty where you can't go to church. It is a socio-political death sentence.
Yeah, it completely strips you of legal protection.
It signals to every neighboring kingdom that your lands, your property, everything is just up for grabs. So he is essentially telling the most powerful monarch in Europe, I will forgive you for the political maneuvering, but I will utterly destroy the men who breached the physical security of this office.
It is just a masterclass in isolating the radical actors while keeping the broader diplomatic channels open. And his administrative vision extended way beyond the immediate crisis in Rome and France.
Yeah, he really understood the power of intellectual networks. The sources show him looking way out to the frontier of the church, over to the Balkans. Drawing on his early background in Venice, he orchestrates this massive diplomatic mission, sending Dominican friars from Hungary down to Durrës in modern-day Albania.
Which was such a brilliant exercise in soft power, sending friars rather than soldiers.
Yeah.
Durrës was this critical port city on the Adriatic, sitting right on the fault line between the Latin West and the Orthodox East.
Right. It was a chaotic blend of different religious rites and loyalties. But how does sending a group of friars actually solve a geopolitical border dispute?
Because the Dominicans were the intellectuals, they were the standardizers. By deploying them to this cultural crossroads, Benedict XI was attempting to unify the liturgy and firmly anchor the region into the Roman sphere of influence.
Organically, instead of through military force.
Exactly. He used his trusted academic network to achieve what an army never could, which is true cultural integration.
So he is operating this massive, highly sophisticated geopolitical chessboard. But if you were a regular citizen or a local friar at the time, you didn't really see the diplomatic genius. You saw a man surrounded by the mystical and the supernatural.
Oh, absolutely. The medieval mindset viewed the world through a deeply prophetic lens, and Benedict XVIII's life generated some wild mystical phenomena.
Which the historical texts carefully record, right?
Yeah, because it served to legitimize his rapid ascent. For instance, during a general chapter meeting back in 1288, a friar named Thomas de Luni experienced a vividly detailed prophetic vision predicting Nicola's eventual papacy.
And there was also a friar in Torcello who supposedly predicted his exact career trajectory step by step. Like he said, you'll be provincial, then master general, then cardinal, and finally pope.
Right.
But out of all the texts we reviewed, the most striking story for me isn't a mystical prophecy. It's a profound, real-world miracle of mercy.
The Easter Monday story.
Yes. Let's set the scene for this. It's Easter Monday, 1304. The Pope is celebrating High Mass. Now, the protocol for this is rigid beyond belief. Every single movement is choreographed. But suddenly, a pilgrim breaches the security, interrupts the sacred liturgy, and desperately begs the Pope to hear his confession immediately.
Which, under standard papal protocol, the guards would have physically removed the man. An interruption of the Pope during the most sacred liturgy of the year was simply unthinkable.
But Benedict stops. He actually leaves the altar in the middle of the Mass, steps down, hears this desperate pilgrim's confession, absolves him, and then calmly returns to the altar to finish the liturgy.
What's fascinating here is the significance of that action, which was recorded by Cardinal Caesar Bronius. The rigid Latin Mass protocol demanded absolute perfection. But by stepping away from the altar, Benedict was making a radical theological statement.
That the person mattered more than the rules.
Exactly. The immediate spiritual need of a single desperate human being superseded the rigid perfection of papal ceremony. It perfectly encapsulated his radical prioritization of human mercy.
It is just an incredible moment of humanity. But this reign of mercy was tragically and almost suspiciously cut short, just 8 months. Which brings us to the summer of 1304, July 7th in Perugia. Pope Benedict XI dies suddenly.
And the official record says dysentery.
Right. And that is the consensus of most modern scholars, yes.
Yes. The academic consensus leans heavily toward natural causes.
Okay, hold on. You are looking at the same texts I am. You expect me to believe that modern scholars are right to just chalk this up to summer dysentery? The man literally just dropped a devastating excommunication on Guillaume de Nogaret, a ruthless political operator who had zero qualms about invading a papal palace and effectively killing the last pope. And a few weeks later, Benedict suddenly drops dead after supposedly eating some poisoned figs. The timing is beyond suspicious.
It's definitely a wild coincidence.
It feels incredibly naive to ignore the assassination theory.
Look, your skepticism is entirely justified, and it actually mirrors the rampant rumors of the time. Nogaret absolutely had the motive, the network, and the ruthlessness to arrange an assassination via poisoned figs. It fits the political narrative flawlessly.
So why do scholars dismiss it?
The reason modern scholarship leans toward natural causes is the epidemiological reality of 14th century Italy. Dysentery in the height of summer was a massive, highly lethal killer, regardless of who your political enemies were.
Okay, that's fair.
Both realities can coexist, you know. He had enemies who wanted him dead, and he lived in an era where microscopic enemies were just as efficient as assassins.
True. But whether it was an assassin's fig or contaminated water, the impact of his sudden death was catastrophic for the papacy.
Oh, the power vacuum it created was immense. Without his unifying presence, the conclave in Perugia violently fractured into pro-French and anti-French factions. And remember how his election took one day?
Yeah.
This new conclave dragged on for 11 grueling months.
A complete collapse compared to his unanimous election.
Precisely. And the fallout changed the course of European history. The gridlock eventually resulted in the election of Clement V, a Frenchman with deep ties to King Philip V. And Clement V never even traveled to Rome. He remained in France, inaugurating the Avignon papacy.
The era where the French monarchy heavily dominated the church infrastructure. It really is one of history's great what-ifs. If Benedict hadn't eaten those figs or caught that illness, would the papacy have remained in Rome?
It's very possible.
But his influence didn't just vanish. Almost immediately after his death, the people he had governed began reporting miracles at his grave in the church of San Domenico Vecchio in Perugia.
The veneration was swift and deeply felt. A magnificent marble monument was constructed for him. It's actually attributed to a follower of the famous sculptor Arnolfo da Cambio. If you look at the design, it features him lying in effigy with angels drawing curtains apart, showing him kneeling before the Madonna.
And it survived centuries of being moved around the church before final restoration in 1959. It took centuries, but the church officially recognized what the people already believed. Pope Clement XII beatified him, declaring him blessed on April 24th, 1736.
Really cementing his legacy.
Yeah, but as we wrap up this deep dive, we have to ask.
Yeah.
So, what does an 8-month papacy from 700 years ago actually mean for you today?
I think the core lesson here is the mechanics of integrity when an entire system is collapsing. Benedict XI navigated extreme poverty and rose through a strict meritocracy. And when the ultimate test arrived at Anagni, when physical security failed and the instinct to flee overwhelmed everyone else, he stayed. He anchored himself.
And when he gained ultimate power, he didn't use it for absolute vengeance. He targeted the specific bad actors but sought peace and kept the system running. But there is a detail in these texts about his mindset before he ever became pope that completely reframes how I view his courage.
This is one of the most fascinating details in the archives. Before his rapid ascent, during his years as a scholar and lector, Nicholas Boccasini spent massive amounts of time writing extensive commentaries on the Book of Revelation, the Apocalypse.
Think about that for a second. You spend your academic life studying the literal end of the world, texts about cosmic betrayal, violent beasts, and the total collapse of earthly security. And then, years later, you are standing in a palace as armed mercenaries kick in the doors. Your world, the center of your reality, is violently fracturing right in front of your eyes.
It raises a profound question about how our internal frameworks dictate our response to external chaos. When Benedict looked at the mercenaries breaching the halls of Anagni, it is entirely possible he saw the events of his own life mirroring the apocalyptic texts he had mastered.
Wow.
He was quite literally looking at what must have felt like the end of the world. But instead of responding with the panic of the court or the vengeance of his predecessor, he chose to respond with profound, unyielding peace.
That's incredible. The next time you find yourself in a situation where the architecture of your life or your career feels like it is collapsing and everyone around you is panicking, remember the laundress's son from Treviso? The leader who studied the apocalypse looked it in the eye and held his ground.